Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Exercise is Bullshit, which stands for bodybuilding utilizing logical lifting and scientific heuristics to inform training. I am joined today by Dr. James McKendry, who I want to say is out of McMaster, but now you're out of the University of British Columbia, or is it British Columbia University? Just introduce yourself. Say hello.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks very much, Logan, for having me on the podcast. My name is James McKendry. I'm a new-ish assistant professor in nutrition and healthy aging here at the University of British Columbia out in Vancouver.
Yeah, so other side of the country, from Ontario, where you spent so many years under the tutelage of Stu Phillips, who's some of our listeners. I haven't had Stu on this show, but a lot of our listeners will probably know of Stu, one of the preeminent protein and muscle researchers in the world, and James was right there with him for a number of years. So now he's kind of creating his own dynasty out in British Columbia. We were just catching up a little off air about that. So James, why don't you give us a little background for listeners who are not familiar with you? How did you kind of get into exercise science research? What was sort of your journey from high school, I guess, going into college and deciding that you wanted to pursue this career?
Well, thanks very much. It's finally nice to have Stu take the training wheels off and let me loose, leading my own lab. So uh, it's been a interesting start to setting up my own lab. I'm finding out the stresses and strains of getting your own thing going. So it's fun. But how I got into this, way back when in high school, I realized my long dreams of being a professional soccer player and earning millions of dollars a week probably weren't going to pan out. Dialed in my focus a little bit more on the academic side of things, and my physical education teacher went to the University of Birmingham to do sports science degree, or kinesiology for the folks here in the US and Canada. And I loved it. It was really during my third year where I got exposed to my own, or helping out with a research project that was being run by a PhD student, that really grabbed my attention for taking part on leading science research. The project itself was a little different from what I do now. It was focused on the brain's response to images of food following exercise, so more appetite regulation biology. But now, what really got me excited, like any young male trying to get the biggest muscles possible, was the cellular and molecular mechanisms behind what dictates how big you or quickly you can kind of grow your muscles. And my foray into research was a master's project investigating how changing the rest interval between sets modifies the rate at which you build muscle in the very acute period post exercise and a kind of delayed acute like the following day. And the exposure to muscle biopsies and stable isotope tracers and the mechanisms involved in muscle mass regulation has laid the foundations for now what is hopefully going to be my career for a very long time.
That's awesome. And was it after your master's that you transitioned over to McMaster in Canada, or was that, did you get your master's at McMaster?
Yeah, so I did all of my schooling at the University of Birmingham in the UK. So bachelor's in sports science, master's in sports science, but nutrition and metabolism focused, and then a PhD in exercise as medicine, where I took the kind of same interests in muscle mass regulation from my master's, but applied it to an aging population who are extremely active and seem to defy the laws of nature in protecting themselves against muscle mass loss in master athletes, like 60, 70-year-olds that are still running marathons. In fact, there was one 60-year-old gentleman who was still squatting kind of 2.5 times body weight and moving hundreds of kilos. He was an absolute machine. So yeah, it was those fascinating individuals that I focused my PhD work on. And post PhD in 2019 is when I moved to Hamilton, Ontario to work with Stu Phillips for 5 years now, and only just recently left.
Okay, so my question was, what is your focus now on your new lab? Is it going to be on hypertrophy specifically? Is it going to be a protein lab? Is it all the above? And you guys are just kind of interested in all different aspects of muscle building, aging populations. What's kind of the focus in your mind?
Yeah, I would say there's really two kind of ways to partition what my interests lie, where my interests lie now. And one is which maintaining my real passion in understanding the cellular and molecular mechanisms that are responsible for dictating skeletal muscle growth or loss. So there's a mechanistic focus on one side, and then a kind of nutrition and physical activity intervention side, more clinical trials and placebo-controlled clinical trials in young and older individuals, and looking at how those things are different between across the ages.
That's great. And do you have a selection of students that are already there that are pursuing their PhDs, or do you kind of have to build that from the ground up as well through new applicants?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It is a slow process to get everybody onboarded, but having started towards the end of last summer, I now have a slowly expanding team. So, a research assistant to an incoming master student and an incoming PhD student, a couple of summer undergraduate research assistant positions, and several volunteers in the lab as well who are mostly enrolled in their undergraduate programs in food, nutrition, and health, but just looking to get some exposure to research in older populations.
That's awesome. And you mentioned too as well offline that you guys are building a brand new lab, which obviously is going to make all this research in the future harder. So, as we transition into this next part of the conversation, it's just really cool to see kind of building something up from the ground up. And I'm excited to see what you guys end up doing over there. So, one of the things I like to chat about, because obviously the exercise science research from the time I was in my undergrad or even in high school and kind of learning basic kinesiology and biochemistry and stuff was very different than I think what it is, 15, 20 years later today. Is there anything in the time, the time frame I like to give because it changes so fast is like in the last 3 to 5 years, just being so deep in the research that you've really taken kind of a complete 180 on maybe previously held beliefs of what you thought was a mechanistic trigger of muscle building or any other aspect of physiology that you've just been like, whoa, I was so wrong on that. And now, you kind of are following the research.
Yeah, I think there's the most obvious one for me is until I started my postdoc, I was pretty adamant and convinced that animal sourced proteins were the only way I was going to build a sufficient amount of muscle. And recent evidence, long term training studies, dietary interventions, all the way through to more acute muscle protein synthesis studies like what I performed during my postdoc with Stu have shown quite nicely that so long as you're consuming enough protein, close to the kind of 1 point, somewhere at least above 1.2, but closer to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body mass per day, the source becomes much less important, and you can certainly build considerable amounts of skeletal muscle when adhering to a more vegetarian or vegan style diet. That was a
Yeah.
hard adjustment for me as a uh, avid meat eater, may I say. But I think I'm not like a good scientist. I'm not unwilling to change my mind when the data's there. It's really hard to argue against the fact that animal source proteins and plant based can lead to similar accretion of skeletal muscle.
Yeah, that's been an interesting kind of transition for me as well. Because when I was coming up, it was like vegan and plant-based proteins were just vastly superior was kind of my understanding. And obviously, being someone who follows Stu pretty regularly, I still, and I'm sure this is not what we're talking about today. I'm sure we could do a whole episode on just plant versus animal protein, and I'd probably like it more than talking to Stu because you obviously have a bias a little bit more towards animal protein as well. I guess my only question on that is, we don't need to go too far down this rabbit hole. The thing that always comes up when I talk to people about animal versus plant is how are you getting the appropriate amino acid profiles if you're not using supplementation. And then I think that's where the conversation becomes a little more nuanced. Like, yes, you can eat a vegetarian diet and build muscle, but you're probably going to be eating more processed, protein isolates than you would be if you were just eating animal based diet and just getting your protein from food and the occasional protein shake. Is that a pretty accurate representation? Or
Yeah, I think it just requires a little more diligent planning. So yeah, you're right. It can be done, and there are amino acids which are distinctly lower in some plant-based proteins, and so long as you're particularly leucine, we know is really important for skeletal muscle. And some plant sources is a little bit lower, so you might need to eat a little bit more, which could come packaged with additional calories. Or yeah, it
yeah, and
it
that's
does
really
become a
the
little more nuanced. You're right.
Yeah, and that's kind of the conversation I've gotten to with vegans and vegetarians in the past is like, yeah, you can easily, not easily, it takes a little more nuance, it takes a little more thought to build as much muscle as possible on a vegan or plant-based diet. It's possible, but then you look at the average vegan, or at least the meme of the average vegan. It's like I don't think they're hitting their protein goals regardless of what's going on. So you have obviously the pro vegan athletes that are doing everything right and they're optimizing, they're getting B12 and they're doing all the things that they're missing from animal sources. But is the average person that's just like, I don't want to eat meat, but I want to work out. Are they getting enough protein? Maybe, maybe not. Again, not our conversation
Yeah.
today, but always super
Yeah.
interesting to me. But it does kind of play into this idea of what we are going to be talking about, which was this paper that you were part of on mitigating disuse in aging. So can you kind of frame up this paper a little bit for us and give us some of the background?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think to set the scene, this is more of a narrative review, kind of our thoughts about what can be used perhaps as a strategy to prevent or like prepare for a bout of disuse, maybe some ways in which you could prevent losing significant amounts of muscle, and then approaches you can implement following a bout of disuse to try at least to get back to baseline or above. And the idea, I think, was we kind of discussed some of the mechanisms involved in the loss of skeletal muscle in response to a bout of disuse and how that might differ between young and older individuals. And then the idea of prehabilitation and preventing during and recovering that lost skeletal muscle. And I think there are some practical strategies as well about how to strategically implement some of those uh, recommendations that we suggest, whether that's resistance bands or those kind of things, to get back to baseline and stop losing your muscle.
Yeah, and just for reference for our listeners who are not super familiar with like different types of papers, most of the papers when we think of like exercise science research, it's like there's 20 participants in a lab. They're going through multiple interventions. They might have a control group versus a intervention group, or they're doing branched off interventions to compare the two and kind of track. This was more just a narrative review is kind of like, here's all the evidence we have. We're going to make some recommendations based on all the history of the research and ideas of how you could, in this case, fight these periods of disuse. So a period of disuse would be like you had hip surgery, right? And you're out for a month afterwards and you're horizontal on your bed. And we know during those time periods, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as well as we go through it, you can lose significant amounts of muscle when you're 20 years old, right, and you have ACL surgery and you're out for 2 weeks before you're, up and moving around again, probably not that big of a deal. If you're 75 and you blew out your Achilles playing pickleball and you're down for 2 months, like that could be the difference of I'm going to live to 95 or I'm maybe not going to see 76. So I think this stuff is super important. But let's just define some kind of terms here as we talk about all this stuff. Why do we lose muscle as we age? And obviously the term we hear a lot is sarcopenia. Can you kind of define maybe some of the reasons why we're losing muscle? What is sarcopenia? What are some of these things that people should be aware of if they're not exercising?
Yeah, so I think the most commonly used definition for sarcopenia is the age-related loss of skeletal muscle mass and the associated strength and function that comes packaged with that loss. Um, There are a whole host of reasons why you might begin to lose muscle mass as a result of aging. Is it the natural age-related decline? Is it kind of changes in activity status that typically accompany aging as well? And there are a whole host of cellular mechanisms responsible, fiber, muscle fiber property changes, the chronic inflammation that older individuals often find themselves in, or the changes to endogenous hormones. When females go through menopause, they see a significant reduction in some of the sex hormones. And the same with guys through andropause, they see a reduction in testosterone concentration. There are a whole host of cellular mechanisms that could be driving this. And unpicking what is the result of aging per se, or primary aging, so how old you are, and biological aging, so like the environmental and behavioral factors that contribute to accelerating that loss, can be quite difficult. But what we do know is that unfortunately it starts a lot sooner than most people would probably anticipate. And I would hazard a guess, though it's sometimes difficult to detect really early on, that it begins as early as 40 years of age is when people start to see a substantial loss of skeletal muscle,
Yeah, I
which
know
is
the
quite
numbers.
concerning.
Yeah, the numbers I've seen in the past are even more concerning. We used to quote a study that was something to the effect of after the age of 30, as activity goes down, you start to see somewhere in the ballpark of zero point 0.5 to 1.5% per year, so 5 to 15% per decade. And maybe that was at 40, but I think it was at 30 or 35 when that started, just because of sedentary lifestyles, right? So you're not as active as you were in your 20s. Maybe you have kids, you're working in an office 8 hours a day. So all of these things can potentially, decrease the amount of skeletal muscle mass you have. And then you also talked about we're living in an environment where menopause is starting to hit women earlier than ever, and the same thing for men. Like, the average testosterone level of the average 40-year-old man is probably, I'm just making these numbers up, but it's probably 20% lower than it was 20 years ago. And it might be more than that, it might be less, but I know it's significantly lower than it used to be. So all of these things are contributing factors. But people hear that and they go, oh well, it's just part of the process of aging, that's just what happens as we get older. But why is losing muscle mass, specifically skeletal muscle mass, so potentially damaging to individuals as they get older?
Yeah, I think the most important point to hammer home here is that skeletal muscle mass and the associated strength that kind of is accompanied are independent risk factors for lifespan and the development of several chronic diseases. So whether that's cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and then even more cognitive impairments as we get older. So they are skeletal muscle is absolutely critical for functional metabolic health. And the earlier you start to lose it, the shorter period you're going to experience in good health, essentially. So it really compresses those years of good health and extends the period in which we experience chronic disease, which is just
And when
terrible.
you say independent factors, you're specifically talking about, like, an independent factor would be outside of diet, outside of smoking, outside of all these other interrelated factors, just purely, regardless of if you smoke versus if you don't smoke. If you have more muscle mass versus somebody who's also a smoker and you've both been smoking for 40 years, the person with more muscle mass is going to live longer on average, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, so I think even when controlling for all those other variables, whether it's kind of age, sex, height, weight, smoker status, diet, skeletal muscle mass, and function are independent risk factors. So the more we can do to protect against those losses and start much earlier, the likelihood that we live longer, healthier, happier lives is greatly enhanced.
Yeah, and this is kind of going into that idea of like health span versus lifespan, right? So when I think of general medical care in the United States, and I'm not sure if it's the same way in the UK and in Canada, but it's you almost never hear of a prescription for exercise, and that's changing a little bit, maybe with the newer administration and like RFK's focus on that. But it's going to be a long time before a doctor's pulling out a prescription pad to Gold's Gym, right? So it's more, here's metformin, here's some insulin. Like, take these things that are going to be a band-aid on the problem and not actually fix it. So it's always been so frustrating to me as an exercise practitioner to see that these things are not really being advocated for from a medical perspective, which is where most of these older individuals are getting their information anyways. They're not really seeking out, for the most part, exercise professionals unless they've been told by maybe a more proactive doctor, like, hey, you need to do something about this muscle loss as you age. Now, besides just the natural progression of being sedentary, what are some other ways besides just, we'll call it normal sarcopenia, right? Age related muscle loss, that older individuals can lose muscle even faster?
It really doesn't take much to accelerate the loss of skeletal muscle. So it could be something as benign as an acute illness. So you get the flu, you're kind of out of sorts for a few days, maybe you don't leave the house, or a something really common with older individuals, maybe it's a joint replacement or something along those lines. It doesn't take a lot, and the rate at which you lose muscle in response to some of those acute stimuli can be drastic. Over the course of a week from reduced physical activity, so there's not total bed rest, but just a couple hundred to 1,000-ish steps a day, you can lose 4 to 5% of your thigh muscle mass, which has
That's
significant
crazy.
consequences for physical function, long-term metabolic health. So that loss of muscle often comes packaged with reduced insulin sensitivity or glucose uptake impairments, essentially. So that can predispose you to being at an increased risk of developing metabolic complications like type 2 diabetes in as little as kind of 7 days, which is mind blowing.
Yeah, that's mind blowing. And you think this just popped into my head too about, again, the average person that's not training, that's older, that's already at a risk factor for this. And obviously, today we're going to be talking about ways to mitigate the risk from things like periods of active disuse. But I'm just thinking of, like, you go to a resort, you go to a all inclusive place, right? And people are sitting on their ass, not working out and drinking, and literally sitting on a beach chair for 10 hours a day, right? And I've seen studies, I think maybe Sarah Oikawa had been part of something where it was like, you're shrinking the steps from 5,000 to 1,000 or less per day, and you're going to see drastic losses in muscle mass too. If you're somebody who's older, that's retired, that's taking vacations all the time, and you're not active on those vacations, it doesn't even take you breaking your hip, right? If you're just sitting on your butt on a beach chair all day, you're doing yourself a whole lot of disservice too. But why is this particularly devious from a longevity perspective for older individuals in particular?
Yeah, I try to cram this word into most of my presentations, but it's because largely older individuals don't possess the same bounce back ability that younger individuals do. So once they lose that muscle mass, it becomes much more difficult to get it back. Whereas in a younger individual, sometimes short disuse bout, whether that's from an acute illness or a limb immobilization or sitting on your butt for a few days to weeks, when they return to their normal physical activity, they generally get most of that back. But in an older individual, even with aggressive strength training, some really cool data back from Charlotte Sueta in 2009, they did a 2 week immobilization period in young versus old, and then a 4 week retraining period. So, in response to the immobilization, the young group actually lost probably a little bit more muscle mass in that period. However, following the retraining, younger individuals get almost all of that back. They're back to kind of 99%. And if they continue along that trajectory, they'll be back 6 weeks to full fitness, back to full muscle. But in the older individuals, despite losing a little bit less, they still don't return to baseline with 4 weeks of a pretty aggressive strength training. So the fact that they lose it, and most people don't do that resistance training following these periods, so they never get it back, which means the decline becomes a step and just precipitous declines that never really fully recover.
Yeah, and that's, you hear those stories all the time of, oh yeah, Nana was great until she was 75 or something, and then all of a sudden got sick and died. And it's like, well, was that something that really happened because she got sick once and she got, the flu and just died from that? Or was it that, that period of bed rest finally, was the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, where there was this precipitous step down effect, like you said, over the period of 20, 30, 40 years where she wasn't doing anything to actively fight back against that muscle loss. And it's just so sad to see people who like, oh yeah, now you're just supposed to hurt. Like you're 60, you're just supposed to be sore and it's supposed to be hard to get up from a chair. Oh, I'm 70, I gotta use a walker or whatever. And it's like, well, no, I mean, you've seen those people in the study you mentioned in the beginning, right? Where the older masters athletes that are still out there running marathons. It's like we do have a choice in this matter. So, I saw a statistic too. I wanted to share this because it was staggering and it was really scary too. But I was doing some googling, and is approximately 25% of older individuals, and I think this was classified as 65 and up, will die within 1 year post surgery hip replacement. So, like, if you're over, let's say 70, even to be gracious, and you have a hip replacement, there's a 25% chance you're going to die. That is bananas and doesn't have to be the case. Do you have any other statistics like that? Anything that pops off the top of your head? I mean, the 1 week and losing 5% in skeletal muscle mass is pretty staggering as well.
Yeah, so I think the important point to hammer home that muscle loss occurs severely and set onsets rapidly. The 25% of people like passing away within 1 year of post hip surgery doesn't surprise me. Um, I think the focus needs to be on these folks building a sufficient, essentially preparing for those periods, which are, as you get older, sometimes unavoidable. So building up sufficiently large reserve of skeletal muscle that is functional and strong. And then when you undergo those periods of disuse, then you're much better prepared. You've got a capacity that you can lose during that bout of disuse, and then you're kind of primed to recover it much more quickly. So I don't have any other statistic for you. I think that one hammers home the point enough. That is
It might have been
pretty,
23%. So not, but still crazy amount.
yeah.
Um, so I guess I like to think of it as kind of like a 401k, just because you mentioned about talking about, having those reserves, right? It's so easy. We talk all the time, just in general about building wealth for the long term over your life. And I don't think enough people put emphasis on really strength training. Even a minimal amount is really like investing in your longevity, right? And when you do have those periods, if you have a bigger buffer, right, if the stock market goes down a little bit, you're not going to lose everything. And then over time, you have more time than somebody else so that you can actually increase, your 401k, if you want to use that analogy, where somebody who's only got 10 grand in the bank and the market crashes, it's like, well, they're screwed. They're not coming back from that. So, framing it up like that as it's an investment in your future. And that transitions nicely into what are some of the things that people can do, hearing some of these crazy stats to mitigate these risks. Obviously, we've talked about strength training, increasing your activity, higher protein consumption. But what are some of the strategies that you guys looked at in this paper for really helping people kind of frame up the low bar for entry to really get a high return on investment?
Yeah, I think most the biggest kind of buttons that we can push in terms of having the largest effect on these things are regularly performing strength training, so we build up that reserve capacity of skeletal muscle mass and function. Higher kind of non-exercise activity would be useful in terms of maintaining more healthy body composition so that we don't perhaps accumulate loads of uh, unwanted adiposity that can contribute to accelerating the loss of skeletal muscle. High protein diets are, of course, one lever that we can kind of lean on. What I would say, though, is exercise is probably the most important, and protein nutrition is really the icing on the cake. And where most people tend to focus all of their attention, of course, are on the nutritional supplements that people like to ingest. And that's really kind of the cherry on the icing on the cake, which is they exert very little influence, but getting the other big pieces in place beforehand are the most effective. And it's really important to remember that most people are not doing any exercise at all. So the biggest benefits really come in from going from doing absolutely nothing to doing something. And there are a large proportion of older adults, in fact, younger and older adults, that don't even meet the physical activity guidelines. Starting with something that you enjoy and can stick to and is progressively challenging would be the biggest lever that I would lean on. And you're going to get the most bang for your buck just by doing something, I think.
Yeah, and you guys talk about some strategies here that are especially low hanging fruit that I think we'll get into in a second. You know, it was interesting too. A lot of the studies show, and I think you mentioned this in your paper, masters athletes with a history of training have across the board better post surgery outcomes, meaning people who do have this history, this reserve of strength, that 25% are going to die. I guarantee you those people are not in that category, right? Without extenuating circumstances where maybe they have some other, predisposed condition, but just from a muscle wasting perspective, the more of that reserve you have, the better prepared you can be for this. So, and I think one of the things you guys touched on too is just the prehab aspect. So even if you haven't been doing something, but you do know that you've got some kind of surgery coming up in the future, what would be some recommendations? How much time would somebody need to invest to really start preparing themselves? Say it's 4 or 6 months out for hip surgery, or maybe it's in England and it's 2 years out because you guys have the what
Yeah.
is it called? HHS?
Yeah, the NHS, the National Health
NHS,
Service.
NHS,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. The earlier you start doing these things, the better, essentially. But there are, of course, cases when you have an opening becomes available on a surgical wait list, and perhaps you don't have quite as long as you would anticipate. Doing something is always going to be better than doing nothing. But I would say, so long as you can accumulate a few weeks of resistance training, perhaps in preparation, and it doesn't have to be super heavy, it can just be low load lifted to a point where it feels somewhat challenging and is pretty difficult. I think that can be a useful strategy. So the prehabilitation has received a lot of attention in recent years, and appropriate exercise interventions in the run up to a surgery combined with maybe fill in the gaps where your nutrition might not be meeting the mark as well, consuming sufficient protein to complement the resistance training might not protect against all of the losses as a result, but it might better prepare you for a recovery that would be less tortuous had you have not done that.
Yeah, and you guys talk about some of those recommendations in here as far as like simple things, body weight, trying to focus on a full body routine, using things like bands as a modality for a low barrier to entry. Can you kind of talk to us a little bit about maybe the guidelines and the recommendations? Because I think these are important, and we'll talk about them in a little more detail. But what would a routine look like for somebody who doesn't have any experience that wants to maybe start doing some of these things? How would you recommend they maybe structure it? The rep ranges, how many sets they should be doing, and then what would a full body routine actually look like for somebody like that?
Yeah, so I think there are a whole host of, there are many ways to skin a cat in that respect. So I think choosing the modality that kind of works with your routine. It could be body weight, it could be the resistance bands approach, but the current let's use Canada's guidelines at the minute are incorporating from the Canadian Society of Exercise Physiology, incorporating strength training at least twice per week and kind of hitting all the major muscle groups. I think would be a good start in preparing for one of these bouts. When it comes to a kind of structure, I think dependent on the number of times you are able to commit to your workout routine, that might kind of modify how you best do it. I go to the gym myself multiple times, so kind of 4, 5, maybe 6 times a week. So I get to do most muscle groups at least twice. If, however, you're just looking to hit the guidelines, maybe a whole body routine would be more appropriate, such that you do some squat exercises, some push-pull exercises, some shoulders and arms, but something that incorporates at least a couple of sets close to where it feels difficult for all of the major muscle groups will be a great place to start. Bands can be one really useful tool to do that because you don't require signing up for a gym membership. You can do it in the comfort of your own home when you would like to do it as well. So it's really easily to modify around your kind of work schedule, or perhaps you have prior commitments. So there are a whole host of ways you can do it. And I think that's really nice. It doesn't have to be done one way. There's not, if you don't do it this way, it's not going to work. So long as it feels difficult for people and you progress over time, maybe add another band, maybe you put a weight plate on your back while you're doing push-ups or something, or get your grandkids to sit on your back or something. Just so long as you make it increasingly difficult, you're going to get benefits out of it. That's for sure.
I think we're in the age too, James, where it's like there's so much free content available online as well. So when people say, oh, I don't even know where to begin, it's like literally go on YouTube and put, old people full body band workout. And I guarantee there's going to be 10,000 videos that pop up. And, just keeping it simple, like you said, some kind of hip hinge, doing just air squats till your thighs are burning, and then push ups off your knees if you have to. And with the bands, just like a seated row, and then stand on it and do some pushing. And if you can do those, 4 or 5 exercises and you progress that, and then you want to get more complex because you're starting to feel some of the benefits, that's great. Obviously, my company now, we do virtual training. So we work with people all over the country, all over the world. And most of our clients have minimal equipment. They might have a couple resistance bands, or they only have body weight. So having somebody there that can help guide you through that process too. But just like we've mentioned multiple times now, doing anything, even if it's, I'm just going to start with squats on Monday, and I'm just going to do 10 squats. And then on Wednesdays, I'm going to do 10 push-ups. And then on Fridays, I'm going to do a couple of band rows. And if you start with that and just progress that over time, you'll be much better off than if you're not doing anything. So let's specifically talk about like an unseen period of disuse. What would be some strategies? Say you don't have a plan, you are that pickleball player in their 50s who PTs love now, who just blew out their Achilles because they haven't played tennis for 25 years and they thought pickleball was a good idea, and now you can't use your right side. What would be some strategies for training around an injury that's maybe a longer term injury? Anything like that you guys would recommend?
Yeah, you raise a really good point in that we can't always prepare as best we can for these bouts of disuse. Sometimes they're unanticipated, such that you injure yourself and maybe you haven't been doing the prehabilitation that you perhaps said you would commit to. Then having some way of perhaps gating, or at least lessening the damage that occurs as a result of those disuse events could be important. There are a whole host of things you might be able to do. One thing that's often forgotten is contralateral limb training. Sometimes when you train one leg, there is some crossover in terms of maybe not muscle mass, but some of the function and strength can be transferred from a neural perspective, which I think is really nice. It's very unlikely most people at home, if they have limited access to equipment, that they've got neuromuscular electrical stimulation equipment. So that can be one strategy that's useful in hospitals. You can stimulate the muscles electrically, and it doesn't do a great job of protecting against functional losses, but it can do something to protect against the loss of skeletal muscle mass. So those are potential strategies. There are, of course, nutritional interventions which might be worth including, though I would say the removal of the contractile stimulus is a much bigger stressor than the is a much bigger event than you can perhaps mask with nutrition. So focusing on consuming high quality protein throughout the bout of disuse is a useful strategy. Ones that are higher in essential amino acids such as leucine that are really important for muscle mass regulation. There is some work to suggest that high dose omega 3s might be useful in mitigating some of the disuse induced decline of skeletal muscle mass. Uh, and there are always emerging nutritional supplements that are worth trying, but sometimes it can be rather difficult to protect against those losses. And that loss of the contractile stimuli is a pretty robust stimulus. So
Yeah.
preparing
I,
for and recovering from is where I tend to focus most of my attention.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice, and it can obviously be discouraging if I had these grand plans of starting to work out, and now I blew out my knee or whatever it is. But I think again, just in this age of convenience we're in, I think the number I saw in your paper was like only 18% of Canadians are hitting the activity guidelines. I would bet that close to 20 or 25% of Canadians and Americans have either a gym membership that they're not using, or there's a gym, a Planet Fitness, an Anytime Fitness, a 24-hour fitness that's within close enough proximity and not financially limiting to where they can make that work. And in those periods specifically where you're not prepared, but you've had this realization that like I can't allow myself, I'm 65. If I get any worse, I'm not going to be alive much longer. In those periods, I would highly recommend somebody going to a place like a Planet Fitness where you could take advantage of that contralateral training in training your entire upper body using extremely safe, machines that you can obviously hire a personal trainer, or again, just watch some YouTube videos, kind of figure it out on your own of how to do it, but doing something where you don't have to say, okay, well, how am I going to do body weight squats now because I've got this boot on, or I can't even move my, right limb at all. You can do the opposite limb on leg extensions and leg curls and leg presses. And so having the ability, if it's available to you, to use something like that is when I would definitely say, like, get out of your house, go pay the $30 a month or whatever to sign up for a local gym, and at least use it for that recovery period, to make it as beneficial as possible for you. And then obviously post period of disuse, again, either continuing with what you're doing, or if for whatever reason you didn't do anything when you were injured, oh my gosh, definitely get back. Try to do something as quickly as you can. Let's just dial in a little more specifically, because you kind of talked about it a little bit, but from a programming perspective, you hit some of these things. I wonder if there's anything else we're missing. One of the things you guys talk about in the paper is using higher repetitions to increase MPS, so muscle protein synthesis. And there's been a lot of research on this. For our listeners who are unfamiliar, there, when I was going through college initially, and even in high school, there was this idea of the repetition continuum, right? Where if you wanted to build big, strong muscles, you had to work with higher weights and lower reps. And then if you wanted to build muscular endurance, or you wanted to be a runner or a marathoner, you do 15, 20, 30 plus reps. But that's not going to do anything for strength. That's only going to focus on, muscular endurance. Now we've kind of flipped that, and we realize that you can get a lot of benefit regardless of where you are on that continuum. So what would be maybe a good like rep goal kind of idea for people, especially because for older individuals, lifting heavy weights can be kind of intimidating?
Yeah, great question. I think lots of Stu's work over the years has kind of put a nail in that coffin of high weights are necessary to build muscle. He's shown pretty convincingly now that lower loads maybe in the 25 to kind of 30, 40% of the maximum weight that you can lift. So long as you lift it, that it gets difficult, you're kind of close-ish to failure and you get the burning sensation, then you can still build significant amounts of muscle using those lighter weights. And I think that's a really important strategy for older adults who might have mobility limitations that preclude them from arse to grass squatting, perhaps, or perhaps those that even like we were talking about during a bout of disuse, maybe they've got a Achilles injury, so they can't bodyweight squat, but they can do a whole host of lighter weight quadricep focused work. So working around the affected area can be a really useful strategy. And if muscle mass is the goal of trying to build, that works just fine, so long as it feels pretty difficult.
Yeah, one of the other things you guys talk about as well. So, at Reform Fitness, the company I work with now, we mostly focus on single set resistance training to failure with most exercises, right? But I think in this capacity, especially, or if somebody's specifically just starting out, they've never done resistance training before, the idea that they're going to have any approximation of what that burning that we've been talking about actually is compared to just discomfort and getting close to failure. This is where I think multiple sets become especially important. So, say you're using your bands for your overheads, and you're a 70-year-old woman that's never strength trained before, like you're going to get 12, 13 reps in and it's going to be burning like crazy and you're just going to want to stop. And if you stop just there with that one set, maybe you were 10 reps in reserve from actually getting to failure, you're going to see some benefit. Obviously, we know, especially in the beginning, there's still going to be some benefit there, but these would be the times where doing that second or even third set and accumulating some additional volume and contractions is going to be especially important. So I think that's a great recommendation, is that 3 sets, starting with 3 sets. If you're really new and you've got the time, maybe you want to do 5 sets of something and really work towards getting super uncomfortable and what that discomfort and failure gap starts to close. Then you go down to 3, then you go down to 2, and maybe one day you can even work to a single set of actual failure. But I think the general 3 set recommendation is just a great recommendation and keeps that bar to entry really low for people. So some of those other barriers to entry, I know as a trainer, and have you done any personal training or anything in the past, James, or just worked with like students in the lab?
Yeah, mostly students in the lab. I did, when I finished my master's degree, did my NSCA, CSCS,
Oh,
so
okay.
did some strength and conditioning stuff with some elite athletes at England football setup with a couple of friends, but no regular client interaction.
Yeah, elite athletes are the worst people to kind of get your exposure to because they're like good at everything, right? But I've been doing this for a long time now, and I'm always surprised, and I shouldn't be, but I'm always surprised at how little people actually know about strength training and about exercise. And when I'm taking somebody through a routine for the first time, I take for granted saying, "Oh, go find the leg press if they're in a gym." And I don't know what that is. Go find a seated row. I don't know what that is. And things that, you work out 6 days a week. I typically go to the gym 3 or 4 days a week. Like we just take that for granted. So this is where I think like having somebody that you can work with, at least in the beginning, becomes especially important. Or at the very least, like finding a reputable person on YouTube that's got 1 million subscribers. So they're at least doing something right. At least they're engaging at the very least,
Yeah.
whether or not
Yeah.
they're accurate in the information they're giving, but finding some kind of resource that can help you get started. Because with older individuals, especially, even things like you and I might consider simple, they either have no idea what I'm talking about or they have the physical restrictions that make extreme modifications necessary. So the example I'm thinking of is like partial range of motion lunges, which we'll do with our clients. We're just a knee to the floor and you're just doing kind of a part of the way up and back down. I have so many people that can't even get into an accurate lunge position, or their hip mobility is so screwed up that their back is all the way forward and it's really becoming like a low back exercise because they're trying to support their torso. So, having somebody that you can work with in the beginning that's not going to risk you getting injured, because obviously you don't want to sour your exercise experience by trying to do something that you shouldn't be doing, and ending up getting injured. So this is where I think like machines can be such a valuable tool, especially for older individuals, simply because dumbbells are great, barbells are great, I love them, but you can't drop a machine on your head. You can't drop a band on your head. You might snap yourself, that can hurt, but are there any other common barriers to entry that you guys have noticed or going through this review that maybe would make things easier for people trying to break into this?
Yeah, I think you raise a really nice point in that I often am guilty of taking my own knowledge in this space for granted. When I explain something to someone about exercise, it's like they haven't got the same experience being in the gym so many times. They don't know what this exercise is supposed to feel like, or they should, if they can, if they have the means, engage with someone like an expert who's been doing it for years, like yourself, who can fix mistakes that would perhaps lead to re-injury, and because that is exactly where you don't want to be. So I think getting the fundamentals in place, the kind of movement patterns, and becoming familiar with what that should look like and feel like, and how to progress them over time and make changes for some mobility limitations are so crucial, because building bad habits and poor movement patterns can lead to injury. I felt a little bit like you were describing my lunges there, to be honest, with my terrible lack of mobility. But there are a whole host of other barriers that could preclude people. So it could be a mobility limitation, it could be access to entry. But I think education is, with a professional, is like one of the things that it's probably going to get the biggest. Uh, you'll see the biggest change in behavior and effect in these people. So if they learn, like if they engage with a person like yourself, then they learn, and hopefully they might be able to pass on some of those skills to perhaps other family members and get them engaged as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, I think at the very least, most places, and I keep bringing up Planet Fitness just because I have a few clients that work there, but most gyms too will offer some kind of free onboarding session with a personal trainer. Now they're probably going to try to upsell you on sessions, which is fine. You can either take those or not, but at least working with somebody that has some kind of certification, that's seen other people before, that knows how to work around mobility limitations and issues to make you feel safe doing this stuff. Because I think that's probably the biggest barrier to entry, is these people that we're talking about that are so unfamiliar that they're more scared of looking dumb and doing things wrong than they are of dying earlier, which seems totally backwards, but it can be so intimidating for people to just have no idea what they're doing and have to admit that and go to a place and feel like they're completely lost. So to have the advice and the guidance of an expert on this journey, and when the ROI is going to be so beneficial for your long-term health outcomes, like take the time to invest, again, at the very least, like following somebody on YouTube, or doing a free introductory session with someone, to make sure you at least have the foundation and the fundamentals right. So big takeaways here, unless there's anything else we're missing, is obviously muscle is super important and unfortunately often overlooked, especially as we age. But the really important thing is it's never too late to start, right? Even if you're I've seen some studies talked about this on the podcast in the past, but there was a research study I remember from 4 or 5 years ago that was like strength training in the oldest of the old, and it was untrained individuals over like 80, and they still saw tremendous benefits starting at 80 when they'd never done anything before. So it's literally never too late to start, and you're always going to get some benefit from doing it. Things can be simple. Find a simple program, work with someone when you're starting out. You're going to greatly increase your health span and probably your lifespan. But the health span to me is the more important part, and your overall quality of life, even with a super simple resistance training program. Is there anything else to add? Any other maybe big takeaways from this paper, kind of aha moments as you were going through it?
Yeah, I think the way I kind of like to conceptualize it is lifelong prehabilitation. You're kind of always training for something which is almost inevitable. We're gonna experience a bout of disuse, an acute illness, or whatever. So, starting as early as we can and doing what we can to prepare for those situations. 34 years old now, and my goal for the next 6 years, by the time I'm 40, is to get as big, strong, and lean as I physically can before age starts to take effect. But I'm not going to stop there. So, continue that on. I'm training now to become a master athlete, I guess, and try and embody the people I like to study. And I think the important point of it's never too late to start is so crucial. It going from doing absolutely nothing, no matter what age, to doing something is where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. And beyond, there are, of course, diminishing returns. You don't need to be an elite marathon runner or Olympic weightlifter to live forever. That's not going to help. So, what you need to do is do something, do it frequently, do something you enjoy, and make it progressively more challenging, such that you're very well prepared for those bouts of inevitable disuse that we will encounter.
Yeah, I think that's great advice and a great way to kind of wrap this up. If people are interested in contacting you, James, or learning more about your research, or maybe we have a potential PhD student in the future that's listening right now, how can people get in touch with you or learn more about you?
Yeah, so my University of British Columbia email address is james.mckendry@ubc.ca. On Twitter, X, or Instagram is James_McKendry. And if it's perhaps LinkedIn, it's James McKendry, PhD. Yeah, I think those are
Got
probably
to throw the
the
PhD
easy.
in there. You earned it.
Yeah, yeah, those are the easiest ways to get in contact with me. Um, and I think I also, if you're looking through the University of British Columbia website, there's a faculty webpage. So I'm not housed in the usual kinesiology department. I'm part of the Faculty of Land and Food Systems, but in the Human Nutrition program. So if there
Is
are
there
any
anything?
interested,
Yeah,
sorry, yeah, if
yeah.
there are any interested students or you have questions or whatever, please feel free to reach out. I'm really happy and willing to engage.
I might have to contact you about that at some point. I've always thought about getting my PhD. It just doesn't fit into the life right now, but someday I'll come to Canada and we can work together and get jacked.
Oh, for sure. Yeah,
Um,
that'd be great.
any other exciting research that maybe we can keep an eye out for that's coming out in the next few months, year, anything like that that you guys are working on?
Yeah, I think there's some really cool stuff still a little bit lingering from my postdoctoral position with Stu, most of which is geared towards older adults. There are some low load training in overweight and obese older adults. There are some links between the changes in skeletal muscle mass and how that relates to changes in mobility within the community as well. So we've got some longer term follow up studies, kind of 1 year, 2 year follow up, and looking at how accurately measuring skeletal muscle mass with stabilized tape tracers and seeing the relationship between the change in physical function and mobility in the community, which I think is going to be really key because it's in community dwelling older adults in the Hamilton, Ontario area. So some very cool Canadian Institute of Health Research funded work to come out of there. So
Is
that will
that a
be fascinating.
similar isotope model that COSIAM? Well,
Yeah,
that's
so it
cool.
uses the deuterated creatine, where you essentially ingest the pill and then measure deuterated
Gotcha. And you'll measure
creatinine
the
in the pig.
long
Yeah,
term. Yeah. Oh, that's very cool. Yeah. I was asking Alicia when I had her on the podcast if I could get that done, and she's like, nah, it's probably more just for research purposes. But I'm excited to see now that we've got a cool new metric to kind of track over the long term, how that will contribute to the skeletal muscle mass research over the long time. James, this was awesome. I don't want to take any more of your time, but if anybody wants to learn more, I will link your email and your IG and all of that stuff in the show notes. And we will be back in a couple weeks for another new episode. Thank you so much, James.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Logan. I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, it was great. Awesome. Thank you,
Cheers.
guys.